The year 1777 would be known in England as the Year of the Hangman, on account of the many public executions that took place during this period. The epithet had another context as well, for British military leaders took it up in anticipation of the capture and execution of leaders of the American Revolution. From a military standpoint, the year would indeed prove a busy one for the British, involving 2 large-scale amphibious campaigns leading to 4 major battles as well as various lesser engagements. Thus far, we've covered the origins and early evolution of one of these campaigns, General John Burgoyne's invasion of the colonies by way of Canada and Lake Champlain. We continue now where we left off in the previous episode, following the fighting at Bennington and prior to the climactic encounters near Saratoga. This interval would see the reappearance of an American leader who had proven his tenacity in the Canadian campaign of 1775, and who would be instrumental in the fighting to come. His name was Benedict Arnold, a man whose intense ambition would inspire both rare feats of courage and ultimately vile acts of treachery. The fighting at Bennington had given General John Burgoyne ample reason to complain of the gathering storm on his left. But it was not the whole of his troubles, for another storm had already broken on his right. Though word of this new development would not reach Burgoyne for another 2 weeks, Barry St. Leger was not advancing down the Mohawk to Albany as planned, but was in full retreat back to his base on Lake Ontario. St. Leger was a tough, seasoned soldier, and his force was considerable. 500 British and Hessian regulars, 500 Tories, and 1,000 Iroquois Indians under the fearsome Mohawk chief known to the English as Joseph Brant. But when St. Leger's column reached Fort Stanwix on the upper Mohawk in the first week of August, they found the place in good repair and well garrisoned by some 750 Americans. St. Leger laid siege to the place, and there was some sharp sparring before the walls, but it did not look as if the Americans were likely to capitulate any time soon. Worse yet for St. Leger, an American relief column was already on the march up the Mohawk from the east, some 800 men under General Nicholas Herkimer, a veteran of the French wars. When St. Leger's scouts brought news of Herkimer's advance, he was quick to dispatch a force of his own to counter it. A large body of Tories and Indians made their way down the south bank of the river and found good ground in a narrow ravine near the village of Oriskany, and on the 6th of August Herkimer's strung-out column hiked into a well-laid ambush. The battle that blew up here was no proper battle, but a running, confused wilderness melee, neighbor against neighbor and white man against red. The first volley killed most of Herkimer's officers and sent his rear guard running. Herkimer himself went down with a mortal wound, but the bulk of his force hung on and fought grimly for 6 hours. Late in the day, both parties having engaged in as much bloodletting as they could bear, the Tories and Indians fell back west to Stanwix, while the militiamen limped eastward toward their farms. 1 in 3 of Herkimer's men had fallen in this savage encounter on the banks of the Mohawk. When the Tories and Indians returned to Stanwix, however, they discovered that a good deal of mischief had transpired in their absence. Hearing the rattle of musketry from Oriskany, the fort's commander, Colonel Willett, had sallied out with a small force, driving off a light screen of guards and plundering the enemy camps. They hauled away more than 20 wagons full of arms and supplies and destroyed what they could not carry. For the Indians, the loss was devastating. They had left 100 warriors on the battlefield, and now reckoned the loss of all that might sustain them through the coming winter. Understandably, many had seen enough of the White Father's War and began to slip away into the forest. Still, St. Leger had reason to be encouraged. The American relief column had been beaten back, and his hold on Stanwix strengthened. Colonel Willett was a hard man to shake, but he was well aware of his predicament. St. Leger was inching his guns closer to his walls, and sooner or later he would be blasted out or starved out. At this point, Willett himself and a single comrade slipped through St. Leger's lines during a fierce summer storm and rode hard for Schuyler's camp to ask for another relief column. With Burgoyne on the Hudson, Schuyler was unwilling to part with a single Continental, but he called for a volunteer to gather whatever militia he could and march to the relief of Fort Stanwix. Benedict Arnold, now a major general, stepped forward, and in short order was in motion up the Mohawk with 1,000 men. Arnold had courage. Neither friend nor foe ever doubted that. But he had cunning, too. Although in the end he would be too cunning for his own good, just now he had an exceedingly shrewd idea. A half-crazy Dutchman had recently been taken captive, one Han Joost Schuyler, no relation to the general. To Americans he was simply a crazy man. To the Indians, though, he was touched, a kind of holy man. Arnold put Han Joost into a coat riddled with bullet holes and sent him into Stanwix to bear this tale. Arnold and the Americans were on the march, more than 3,000 strong. When St. Leger's Indians asked how many soldiers were approaching, Han Joost, with a simple gesture toward the forest, suggested that they were as many as the leaves of the trees. The Indians were willing to take that reckoning as holy writ, and disappeared. The Tories, meanwhile, were skeptical of mysterious spirits, but had a healthy respect for 3,000 armed men, and they likewise fled westward, leaving guns and gear behind. Thus abandoned by half his force, St. Leger too fell back in haste toward Fort Oswego on the 23rd of August. The next day Arnold marched into Stanwix, and the siege was lifted for good. Indeed, St. Leger's campaign was over. He had fallen 100 air miles short of the intended juncture with Burgoyne at Albany, but more than that, his expedition into the Mohawk Valley had thoroughly roused the American militias. Americans were incensed by the free rein the British seemed to have given their Indian allies, and this anger was intensified when word of Jane McCrae's famous murder rang up and down the valley. On her way to meet her fiancé, a Loyalist officer with Burgoyne, the young woman had been captured, shot, and scalped by Indians in late July. It is hard to measure the influence this particular incident had on the militia's willingness to turn out, but Burgoyne had already begun to see the big picture. Even before the news of St. Leger's defeat reached him at Fort Edward, he wrote, "Wherever the king's forces point, militia assemble in 24 hours." Now, deeply disheartening news was on its way from St. Leger. Darker still was news that had already reached Burgoyne on the 3rd of August in the form of a dispatch from Sir William Howe. It began politely enough, with congratulations for his conquest of Ticonderoga, but closed with a revelation that would shake Burgoyne to his core. "My intention," he wrote, "is for Pennsylvania, where I expect to meet Washington. But if he goes to the northward, and you can keep him at bay, be assured I shall soon be after him to relieve you. Success be ever with you." This was dicey news indeed. When and whether St. Leger would reach him was still an open question, but one thing was certain: Sir William was not coming any time soon. And though Howe was a redoubtable fighter, speed was not his greatest gift. Washington, on the other hand, had shown both a gambler's steely nerve and the ability to cover ground in a hurry in his flying raids at Trenton and Princeton. Then, too, regardless of what Washington did, 20 miles down the west bank of the Hudson at Stillwater was a gathering American force of which Burgoyne knew very little. Keeping Howe's dispatch to himself, he seems for a time to have contemplated a withdrawal to Fort Ticonderoga, perhaps even to Canada. Or at least this is what he wrote to Lord George Germain. Such a move would not have been unwise. But both his original design and Germain's orders were to force his way to Albany. For Gentleman Johnny, a retrograde motion was a frank admission of defeat, and so on to Albany he would march. It was nearly the middle of September, though, before he was ready to move. By then, the twin battles at Bennington had reduced his effectives by 1,000 men, and he knew that no help from St. Leger would be forthcoming. For the moment, A pleasant Indian summer had settled over the upper Hudson, but he had just 30 days' rations, and hard weather was not far off. Burgoyne might have pushed his column down the east bank of the river to a point opposite Albany, but crossing the wide river there, presumably under fire, would have been supremely difficult. Accordingly, he threw a bridge of bateaux across the river just above the Batten Kill on the 13th of September, and 2 days later his entire force was on the west bank at Saratoga. As the last details broke up the bridge behind them, Burgoyne's army started south, groping its way toward the enemy. The enemy was in fact near to hand and in strength, 6,000 strong, with more arriving every day. They had a new commander as well, Horatio Gates, who had at last persuaded Congress to displace Schuyler in the Northern Department. Few of the politicians seemed to realize that the fact the American cause still had a Northern Department was owing in large part to Schuyler's intelligence and energy. But Gates's appointment suited his Yankee army, and there was no question that he was an able administrator. He was lucky as well in his subordinates, particularly in a Polish-born engineer, Colonel Thaddeus Kosciuszko. While Burgoyne's men were hacking their way through the wilderness north of Fort Edward, the Americans had been digging in on Bemis Heights under Kosciuszko's watchful eye. Just north of Stillwater, the Hudson runs through a narrow defile, and its banks are steep. Here the bluffs of Bemis Heights rise fully 200 feet above the water, and a broad wooded ridge runs westward. On this high ground, Kosciuszko laid out 3 sides of a rectangle, 2 miles wide and 3/4 of a mile deep. A sturdy redoubt covered the river road, and breastworks and gun emplacements ran most of its length. Gates held the American right with Continentals. Brigadier General Ebenezer Learned held the center with Massachusetts and New York regiments. Benedict Arnold held the left with a mixed force of Continentals and militiamen. By the time the impending battle opened, the Americans would have something like 7,000 troops on hand. If there was a weakness to the American position, it was on their left, where another wooded hill had been left unfortified. If General Burgoyne was feeling any urgency at this point, he did not show it in the rate of his advance from Saratoga. The army poked along in 3 parallel columns, covering just 6 miles in 2 full marching days, feeling its way toward the enemy. On the 18th of September, the Americans made their presence known. A patrol had fallen on a British foraging party digging potatoes in an abandoned field and shot 20 men in 10 minutes. By the following morning, Burgoyne's staff had roughly sketched out the American position on Bemis Heights, and the general resolved to give battle. The wisest part of Burgoyne's plan was that it clearly saw the most vulnerable point of the American lines, their far left. If their flank could be turned and guns rolled up to the undefended hill just west of Bemis Heights, Burgoyne might drive the Americans from the river just as he had driven St. Clair from Fort Tye with the guns of Sugarloaf. His tactical dispositions, however, were less wise. He would attack in 3 columns. Simon Fraser with his own light infantry and the German Jaegers would hike westward and reach for the American flank. Brigadier James Hamilton would command the center with 4 regiments of regulars and drive directly for Bemis Heights. Friedrich Riedzel and the Brunswickers would attack up the river road and, with luck, pry the Americans loose from the direct route of advance. Burgoyne himself would ride with Hamilton in the center. Except for a handful of companies to guard his camps, Burgoyne was committing virtually every man and every musket to the battle against an enemy for once superior in numbers. And this disadvantage in numbers was not even the most significant part of his peril. His columns would be advancing over broken, wooded country, out of sight and close communication of one another, with only a pre-arranged signal gun to tell the 3 commanders when their columns were more or less abreast. An alert and aggressive antagonist might well destroy Burgoyne's army by detachments. Horatio Gates, however, was no very aggressive antagonist. He had an odd nickname for a soldier, Granny Gates, and it suited him. When the British guns began to bang away in the bright morning sun on the 19th of September, He was content to hold his lines and let the British come to him. Benedict Arnold, on the threatened left, however, was by no means content to wait for Fraser's light infantry to approach. He wanted to strike out immediately and come crashing down on Fraser in the woods where the enemy's advantage in artillery could be negated. A long argument, hot-tempered on both sides, now unfolded between Gates and Arnold. Around noon, Gates at last relented. Arnold was given 2 crack outfits, Colonel Daniel Morgan's Virginia Riflemen and Major Henry Dearborn's New Hampshire Light Infantry, and permission to take the battle to Burgoyne on the British right. About 1 o'clock, Morgan's Virginians collided with Fraser's skirmishers and drove them in with a shock. Morgan was in hot pursuit when he got a shock of his own. In a ravine not far from a little clearing called Freeman's Farm, his regiment ran headlong into the main body of Fraser's advance, and ripping volleys of musketry front and flank tore his outfit into fragments for a time. As the riflemen were regrouping on Morgan's signal, a wild turkey gobble, Arnold galloped up with help, sending Dearborn's light infantry and another New Hampshire outfit hustling off into the woods to form up on Morgan's left. Now the battle blew up in earnest. On the northern fringe of the Freeman's Farm clearing, just 350 yards wide, Burgoyne emerged from the woods with 4 regiments of regulars. If this was danger for Arnold's wing, it was also opportunity. Drive a wedge between Fraser and Burgoyne, and decisive victory might be at hand. The thin edge of the wedge would have to be driven in at Freeman's Farm. It looked briefly as if Arnold might turn Burgoyne's right and break his center then and there, but Fraser was quick to send several companies in support, and the British swung westward to check the threat from that quarter. Now it was a brutal, straight-ahead slugging match. Having won Gates's grudging permission to support his attack, Arnold would send 8 regiments surging through the tall grass before the day was out. Several times the American battle lines reached the British guns on the northern fringe of the clearing, but before they could turn them on the enemy, the redcoats would drive them off at the point of the bayonet. The British in turn would attack and close with the defenders, only to be beaten back by tearing volleys of musketry. As one survivor remembered, it was one continual blaze until dark. Burgoyne was in the thick of the fighting, all gallantry now, swinging his hat, with a bullet hole drilled through it, and rallying his embattled lines. Similarly, on the southern edge of the fight, Arnold was everywhere at once, and he was a tempestuous sight to see. "There wasn't any waste timber in him," said one foot soldier. "A bloody fellow he was. He didn't care for nothing. He'd ride right in." Both commanders were now desperate for a way to tip the balance in this seesaw battle before the fighting completely used up their forces. Late in the day, Arnold galloped back to Gates to beg for more men, 1 more regiment to strike 1 more hard blow, but Gates, having committed more than he intended already, refused so much as another musket. By his lights, Arnold had threatened the very survival of his army, and he ordered Arnold to stay right where he was on Bemis Heights. What Gates, of course, could not see from Bemis Heights was that the British center was thoroughly bloodied and very nearly broken. Burgoyne well knew how close to complete disaster he stood. At 5 o'clock he sent a frantic message to Riedesel on the river road. As the day was drawing toward a close, the Germans, 500 foot soldiers and 2 little 6-pounders, came down hard on the American right. Their timely arrival saved their redcoat comrades as it had at Hubbardton. In Arnold's absence, the American lines began to waver and fall back, briefly pursued by the British in the gathering darkness, but without much enthusiasm. The Battle of Freeman's Farm was over. The redcoats could claim the honor of holding the field, but they had paid a grim price. The 4 regiments in the center counted 600 dead and wounded. The 62nd had taken an especially fearful pounding. Of the 350 men who had marched into the clearing, only 60 answered the roll the next day. More than 300 casualties on the American side likewise testified to the ferocity of the fighting at Freeman's Farm. The men of both sides had done their violent best this long day. Indeed, More than one redcoat was revising his opinion of the American Continentals and abandoning his conviction that they could not bear the weight of British bayonets in a stand-up fight. Yet neither the British nor the American commander had made purposeful use of the steadfast skill and stubborn courage of the men in the ranks. Burgoyne's plan was flawed from the outset. When the signal gun started his 3 columns in motion at 10 o'clock, it would be about the last coordinated move his army made that day. In fact, his widely separated columns blundering through the woods presented rich opportunities that Gates refused to see and seize. Fraser, for example, isolated on the American left, was vulnerable. He never even found the hill he was looking for. When Riedzel took half his command off into the woods to go to Burgoyne's rescue, Gates might have driven straight up the river road and broken the British left while Riedzel was trying to save its battered center. Such success as the Americans enjoyed this day was the direct consequence of the energy and initiative of Benedict Arnold. But when the great opportunity was at hand, he was back at Bemis Heights, locked in a futile argument with his commander. Gates's refusal to strike when the iron was hot gave him a drawn battle when he might have won a great victory. Still, for the Americans, it was a sufficient day's work. The southern fringe of the clearing at Freeman's Farm was as close as the British army would ever get to Albany. Despite the bloody check he received at Freeman's Farm on the 19th of September, Burgoyne's resolve was by no means weakened. In fact, much to the horror of his senior officers, he wanted to attack again the very next day. In the end, he was persuaded to give the ranks at least a day to catch their breath and tend to their wounded. That same day, though, a dispatch arrived that changed Burgoyne's mind. Dated the 11th of September, it was from Sir Henry Clinton, who was holding New York while Howe was campaigning in the South, and it seemed full of promise to Burgoyne. "You know my good will," Clinton wrote. "If you think 2,000 men can assist you effectually, I will make a push at Fort Montgomery in about 10 days. But ever jealous of my flanks if they make a move in force, I must return to New York to save this important post." Exactly what this promised in Burgoyne's mind is hard to say. Miraculous deliverance, perhaps. But the hard facts were that the Hudson River forts, Montgomery and Clinton, were well downriver, just 40 miles north of New York, and Clinton wrote candidly that he did not expect to reach Albany. 2 full weeks were to pass before Clinton got in motion, but when he moved briskly. On the 4th of October, in a sharp little fight with vastly outnumbered militiamen, both forts fell. The next day, Clinton's sailors cut through a ponderous boom and chain that blocked passage up the Hudson, but at this point the British general had accomplished all he promised and returned to New York. He was turning his back on Burgoyne and on opportunity also. He had a force of 4,000 men and the Royal Navy to transport it. Americans in genuine alarm expected him in Albany at any moment. Had Clinton reached dry ground on the west bank of the river, Gates might very well have been caught between 2 fires. Indeed, Americans had more alarming news with word of Washington's defeat on Brandywine Creek on the 11th of September. It soon became clear, though, that Clinton had done all the harm he intended to do in the North Country, and meanwhile Gates strengthened his hold on John Burgoyne. By the first week of October, Gates's army, flush with the half-victory Arnold had won at Freeman's Farm, had grown to 11,000. Even John Burgoyne was beginning to see how desperate his predicament was. Since his decision on the 20th of September to wait for Clinton's move against the Highland forts, matters had gone from bad to worse for Burgoyne. Indian summer was slipping away, and there were hard frosts at night now. His sick and wounded numbered 300, with more falling out each day. And with good reason. The army had been on half rations, now it was down to 1/3, and none too healthy at that, the fare consisting mainly of rancid pork and moldy flour. The Americans might starve this army into submission without firing another shot, but as far as shooting went, they were relentlessly active. "Not a night passes," one weary redcoat complained, "but there is firing and continual attacks on the advanced pickets." For the British there was no food, no rest, no relief. In Burgoyne's rear was even more trouble. 1,500 militiamen under General Benjamin Lincoln had swooped down on the portage between Lake Champlain and Lake George, seizing supplies, taking prisoners, burning boats. Restless John Stark had come marching down from the Grants and made a raid on Burgoyne's own bateau. Without these boats it might be impossible to retreat to Canada if it came to that. In fact, Burgoyne's senior officers were quite convinced that it had come to that. Riedel and Fraser argued that at the very least the army ought to fall back behind the Batten Kill before it was completely chewed up right where it stood. It was good advice, too. Start for Canada now, while the army was still on its feet. But Burgoyne would not take it. On the 6th of October, the day after Henry Clinton had come and gone on the lower Hudson, Gentleman Johnny resolved to smash through to Albany. The move would begin with a reconnaissance in force the next day. 15,000 of his fittest men, supported by 10 field pieces, would march for the American left, probing for a weak spot. Once the advance corps discovered the likely spot, the rest of the army would pile through it the following day. They were long odds, but as Gates said of his antagonist, Burgoyne was an old gamester. It was like him to risk all upon one throw. On the evening of the 6th, Burgoyne issued a ration of rum to the advance corps, an infallible sign of an impending collision. The next morning, Gentleman Johnny cast the dice. The reconnaissance in force marched in 3 columns for the American left, advanced for some 3/4 of a mile before shaking out a battle line 1,000 yards wide on a gentle slope just west of Freeman's Farm. Word of the British advance came to Gates at a gallop. The British appeared ready to give battle, their front open and both flanks resting on woods. To their immediate right was a wooded hill from which a telling blow might be struck. Well then, Gates decided, order on Morgan to begin the game. In the first bloody game opposite Bemis Heights, Gates had really given only 2 meaningful orders. First, to let Arnold pitch into the British right, and then to call him off when he had nearly broken their center. Today he seemed resolved to handle his command with more dispatch. While Morgan's men were on a wide circuit through the woods searching for the British right, Gates sent General Enoch Poor's tough New Hampshire brigade with 2 militia outfits in support to attack the British left, and Ebenezer Learned's brigade against their center. A little past 2:30, the New Hampshire Continentals piled into the Grenadiers on the right and smashed them up. The Grenadiers rallied, went scrambling back down the slope in a counterattack, only to run into a punishing volley of musketry that broke them for good. Over the roar of the fighting here, Poor's brigade could now hear the pop and rattle of fighting from their far left, where Morgan's men were now falling on the flank and rear of the light infantry at that end of the line. These redcoats struggled to change front to meet the threat here, but the steady sharp shooting of Morgan's riflemen and the disciplined volleys of Dearborn's light infantry were deadly. Soon both flanks of the British advance were falling back in disorder. The Germans in the center were already under fire from Learned's brigade on their front. When Morgan and Poor closed in on their flanks, they too began to buckle. Seeing his flanks crumpled and his center wavering, Burgoyne sent an aide forward to order a retreat before all was lost irretrievably. But his courier was shot from the saddle before he reached Riedel. About this time, one of Morgan's riflemen finally drew a bead on Simon Fraser, and Burgoyne's ablest subordinate tumbled from his horse with a mortal wound. The retreat Burgoyne intended was now a rout, the wreckage of his battle lines stumbling rearward through the woods. If Burgoyne could rally his men and make a stand at all, it would have to be on his right, where 2 sturdy redoubts had been dug. The Balcarres redoubt, just behind Mill Creek, and the Bremen redoubt to its right rear. Meanwhile, into the battle at this critical juncture galloped Benedict Arnold. What Arnold had been doing all day is not entirely clear, though it is certain that he was fuming with rage and drinking heavily. The source of his rage was not the fleeing redcoats, but his commander, Horatio Gates. After the fight at Freeman's Farm, Gates had written Congress of his victory, conspicuously neglecting any mention of the part that Arnold, Morgan, and Dearborn had played in the battle. A man of vaulting ambition and prickly pride, Arnold had swept into Gates's tent, showered him with insults, and stalked off in a fury. Gates, for his part, relieved him of command and said, in effect, "Ride to Philadelphia and tell your tale to Congress if you like." Arnold's comrades, well aware of his abilities, prevailed on him to stay, but on the day of battle he was a commander without a command. But Arnold was not the sort to sulk in his tent while the British were in full retreat. In defiance of Gates's order, he rode into the fight where Learned's Continentals were pushing the Germans before them. The Continentals, only too happy to see that bold soul ride among them, gave a rousing cheer and drove on with renewed energy. They piled headlong into the Balcarres redoubt, only to find that the light infantry there had a good deal of fight left in them after all. With their backs against the wall, they poured a furious fire into Arnold's attack and blunted it. Frustrated, Arnold now scooped up an advancing brigade and swung them left for a drive at the Bremen redoubt and the British flank. The Brunswickers here, in danger of being completely cut off from the main body, seemed to have been in the process of falling back when Arnold struck. They let loose a ragged volley and began to flee. Bremen tried to rally them, but was himself shot down, some thought by his own men. In the last minutes of the fighting, Arnold galloped into the sally port of the redoubt. His horse was shot out from under him, and a wounded German shattered his leg with a musket ball, the same leg that had been shattered before the walls of Quebec. Arnold had struck his last blow for the American cause. With Arnold's driving force out of the fight, the American advance slowed and then stalled. But it was no matter, really. The British right was broken, and the weary survivors of the reconnaissance in force were seeking the safety of the main line in their rear. Indeed, Burgoyne's army was hopelessly shattered. The Second Battle of Freeman's Farm cost him 600 in killed, wounded, and captured, against an American loss of 150. Under cover of darkness that night, Burgoyne began to pull his exhausted and dispirited men out of line and start them north toward the high ground at Saratoga. On the night of the 8th of October, the rest of the army slogged north in a sullen rain, leaving 300 of their wounded comrades behind to Gates's mercy. The march was misery itself. Horses were played out, and wagons were abandoned. The barges carrying the last of their supplies upriver were soon overtaken and seized. Men simply fell out of line and collapsed in the muck. The fine invasion force that had mustered at the mouth of the Richelieu had now hardly anything to eat, nor the slightest rag to cover itself with. Even in pursuit of a crippled enemy, however, Gates was no very hard driver. By the 9th of October, Burgoyne had managed to get across the Fishkill and dig in at Saratoga. It was no place to make a stand, even a last one, and Burgoyne's senior officers knew it. Gates's lumbering pursuit had given them one more chance, slim as it was, to hike for Ticonderoga as hard as they could go. But while Burgoyne waited, Morgan and Learned came up behind, and soon Massachusetts militiamen were closing in from the east. On the 13th of October, John Stark came down from the north and slammed the doors shut. There would be no knighthood for John Burgoyne. On the 16th, Burgoyne met with Gates to discuss the terms of surrender. In the end, he would have more success at the negotiating table than he had on the battlefield. When Gates demanded unconditional surrender, Burgoyne refused furiously. Gates demurred, and a convention, not a capitulation, was cobbled together, allowing the British and their allies to stack their arms with the full honors of war. This may have been simply proper respect for a brave but beaten enemy, but the most important clause of the convention threatened to squander the very fruits of the American victory. The British were to be paroled and returned to England on the condition that they would not serve again in America. Instead of taking a British army off the board, the convention would simply exchange it for another now on garrison duty elsewhere. Gates later argued that he had to take what he could get then and there because Clinton was again on the move up the Hudson. While Gates and Burgoyne were still at the table on the 16th of October, Clinton did attack and burn Kingston. He even sailed as far upriver as Livingston Manor, 85 miles south of Saratoga. But with militia now active on both banks of the river, Clinton thought better of this belated expedition and returned to New York. That same day, Burgoyne signed the convention. On the 17th, Burgoyne's 5,800 survivors marched out into a little meadow north of the Fishkill, furled their flags, and laid down their arms in a simple ceremony. "The fortune of war, General Gates, has made me your prisoner," said Gentleman Johnny with a final flourish. In the end, the convention was a moot point. When Congress learned of Gates's over-generous and extra-legal terms, they rightly feared that the British would return the troops to America regardless of the agreement, and promptly abrogated it. The so-called Convention Army, having suffered so much under John Burgoyne, now had a good deal to suffer at the hands of Congress. They were marched hither and yon, to Massachusetts, on to Virginia, and finally to Pennsylvania, to sit out the war in miserable captivity. Gates, of course, was swift to inform Congress of his shining success. So flush with victory was he, that this time he was willing to give due regard to the gallant Arnold. He was a good deal slower to inform Washington, however, who was fighting for his life in Pennsylvania just then, and could have used the now idle troops at Saratoga. The reason was not hard to see. Gates was already angling for Washington's job on the basis of a victory that had been won in large part by the shrewd and resourceful leadership of Schuyler and St. Clair and the bold fighting of Arnold. But a victory it was, and decisive too. Burgoyne's army was wrecked, the northern front secure, and New England safe from invasion. More than that, the Americans were discovering what could be accomplished by the steady performance of the Continental line in conjunction with the timely cooperation of the local militias. In Paris, the statesmen were inching closer toward recognition of an alliance with the American cause. In London, Lord George Germain announced to Parliament the very unhappy intelligence from Saratoga. It came as quite a shock to those who had been jollied along by Burgoyne's swift stroke at Fort Ty and Howe's victory at Brandywine Creek. The news also seemed to make a prophet of Sir Edmund Burke, who had warned against trying to manage an American campaign from London. Sir Guy Carleton in Canada was among the few who understood the full meaning of Burke's warning and the disaster at Saratoga. He hoped that this unfortunate event will in future prevent ministers from pretending to direct operations of war in a country at 3,000 miles distance, of which they have so little knowledge as not to be able to distinguish good, bad, or interested advice. Of course, the ministers would continue to try anyway, but for the time being Britain's cause would be in the hands of Sir William Howe in Pennsylvania.